David is an Edgar Anthony Thriller and Arthur Ellis finalist, a Nero and McCavity winner, and a 3-time recipient of the Bram Stoker Award. He's received the Thriller Master Award from the International Thriller Writers and a Lifetime Achievement Award from BoucherCon, as well as an RT Book Review's Thriller Pioneer Award and Comic-Con's Inkpot Award for Outstanding Achievement in Action Adventure. So in other words, more awards than you can shake a stick at, I think. That's just wonderful. He's also incredibly generous with his time to help out here at SouthWest Writers. And every time you show up, you just draw a huge crowd because we all enjoy hearing what you have to say. Also one of my favorite all-time speakers. Just got to throw that in.
Right.
So we've got sort of this set up as a conversation, and I'm going to ask David some questions. And I know that I won't have to ask very many because I know you're so good at understanding what we're looking for.
I talk a lot.
It's good. It's a good thing. I just finished reading your book, which I had not read before, and I'm really glad I did. The Successful Novelist, A Lifetime of Lessons About Writing and Publishing. And it was so interesting. I encourage everybody to read this. I think it gives some insights into the world of writing that you don't get otherwise. I would love for you to tell us, I think one of my favorite parts of that book was your inspiration to become a writer, was where that happened and what happened for that. So if you could share that with us, maybe to start off.
Sure. Graham Greene once said that an unhappy childhood is a gold mine for a writer. And Stephen King was once asked why he wrote horror. And there's a sniffy aspect to that question, why don't you write good stuff? Why are you writing horror? And Steve said, what makes you think I have a choice? And in a way, the same applied to me. You mentioned a successful novelist. And I have a theory based upon a great teacher I had who believed that everybody has a dominant emotion. And if we found our dominant emotion, we knew what we wanted to write about. And he encouraged me to look at my background, understand why I wanted to be a fiction writer. And basically, my father had died in combat. My mother was not able, as a single mother, to support me and at the same time earn a living for the two of us. So she was compelled to put me in an orphanage for a time. And this was a defining moment for me, which I talk about in a moment. After that, she boarded me on a Mennonite farm, and that was fascinating. And that too had a deep impact on me that lasted a long time. Eventually she remarried, but the man she married, who was supposed to, I think what was on her mind, she didn't talk about these things much. I think what was on her mind that she wanted to have a father for me, but he didn't like kids. And there was a lot of fighting in the home, a lot of fighting. One day, he said she'd broken her ribs, and they claimed that it was all in joke that she'd elbowed him with her, and I think it may have been the consequence of a fight. In any case, I lived in terror. And at night, I would, like in a bad prison movie, I would take my pillows and stuff them under my blankets as if I were there, and then I would crawl under the bed. And that's where I slept. And while I was under the bed, I told stories to myself. And the stories I told were me being a hero rescuing people. And this is interesting that I wasn't the victim in these stories. We have all kinds of choices in life. One is to be the hero of our lives or to be the victim of our lives. And I, from the start, was determined not to be a victim. So in a way, under that bed at night, telling stories to myself, more or less, I think, hardwired me into being a writer. And many years later, I realized that there I was then writing stories about rescuing and all that implied. So in a sense, my theme and my genre had been imprinted on me very early.
So that kind of sounds like the self-psychoanalysis part you've talked about in your book.
In my novel, in the writing itself, in The Successful Novelist, I have a section that I suggest is an alternative to outlines, which I find to be non-creative and maybe useful to tell an editor what I've never done one, but I suppose it would be useful in telling an editor what someone was trying to accomplish. But I write letters to myself in which I say, I've got an idea, it's sort of nagging at me. And then the other part of me says, well, what's the idea? And then I describe it. And then the other part of me says, well, what's so hot about that? And then the first part of me tries to explain why it's important to me. And as this weird schizoid conversation occurs, I begin to focus on what's in this idea. The example I give in my writing book is that I was looking at photographs of a house that Frank Lloyd Wright's son had designed for a famous movie actor of the 20s, Ramon Navarro. Very famous, nobody, as an example about the worth of fame, nobody knows about him anymore. Fame is not something you want to pursue. I'm looking at the photographs of him by the swimming pool and the building. It's a very wonderful building. And I realized for the first time that all my life I've associated photographs with death, because photographs freeze time. And we're always, whenever we look at photographs, we say, oh, look at what we looked like back then. Oh, look at how young Aunt Bessie was. Look at how young our Uncle Charlie was. Look at how there are no shrubs there, but now there are shrubs. So it's a freezing of time and a reminder that time does pass and we're all going to die. So how's these for cheery thoughts on a Saturday morning? And I thought it would be cool to write a novel, a thriller, because that's what I do, about a photographer and to explore the idea that photographs and death are connected. And so that's what I proposed to myself. And then the other part of me said, well, yeah, but so what? So I kept nagging at myself to explore the idea, and who would the logical hero of such a thing be? Well, a war photographer, since this is a thriller, a war photographer who's so sickened by what he's seen that he wants to become an art photographer, only to have his past catch up to him. So in little steps in this conversation, I was able to fill in the plot in such a way that it developed the initial idea I had had, and also that in the process, I feel when we work on a book, there should be three objectives. One is to learn something about ourselves. Two is to learn something from the research we do for the book. And the third is to try to do something just different enough in the book that it adds to the history of the genre we're working in. And if I can't accomplish those three things, I'm not interested in pursuing it. So my conversation with myself explores all this. And it's the beauty of it is you don't talk it out. You don't tell your spouse or your partner or your friend or whomever, and it all goes into the ozone and you've talked it out and it's gone. Instead, you have written it, which is writing, and you have the permanent record so that, God help us, if something really serious happens, the death of a child, in my case, the people, houses burned down, they lose their jobs, all kinds of terrible things happen. You can come back to that written document a year, 2 years, 3 years later and get up to speed immediately. So to me, it's really a wonderful technique, but it is ultimately self-psychoanalysis.
I love that. And you talk about that as the way to really focus your book down, the ideas for your book. So you've got a whole section about that, which I love. I thought that was fascinating. Hadn't thought about writing myself and questioning myself. I love it.
And keep saying, so what? So
Yeah.
what? Because that's the whole thing. If our books don't have a so what, why are we writing them? Not that we're being a message. We're not trying to deliver messages because that's boring, but we're nonetheless communicating emotions that if other people understand them in relation to themselves, maybe they'll understand themselves better.
Okay, I have a question for you about writer's block. You talk about writer's block in your book and how you feel about that.
Yeah, well, writer's block exists. Some writers will deny that it does. They're blessed, but it's happened to me a number of times, and there are two reasons for it, I feel. And these are the questions I ask myself when I'm stuck. One is that I'm not being true to the story idea, that I'm making it a fake. And a part of me recognizes that. And it's time for me to step back and take another look at how I'm approaching the material and whether it is indeed what I have in my head and what I'm trying to accomplish. And so there've been a number of times when I have stopped a book or a story because it has, in the simplistic way we could say, fakey, that it just doesn't feel right, and yet I love the idea. So what am I doing wrong? So that's one explanation for writer's block, and the other is that there are elements of the material that we are not ready to address, and that personally we cannot. It's not, the first example is just a failure of craft. We just got confused, and come on, wake up, you can do this better. But the second one, where there are elements in the story that maybe threaten us and we don't even know they threaten us, so we can't move forward because there's that hitch in us that's saying, no, I don't want to go there. So in each case, there are elements that have to be addressed. And whenever I'm having trouble, I say, all right, which is it? Am I not being honest with myself, or am I not being honest with the story? And there's a wonderful process called Neuro-Linguistic Programming. I'm a practitioner. I was certified in it. And it uses language to solve problems for us. So often when I have a block, which may go for the day or it can go longer, it all depends on how honest we are. And there's a classic NLP example where somebody says, I've got this insurmountable problem and I don't know what I'm going to do and I can't solve it and it'll never be solved. And the practitioner says, you can't solve it. No, it's impossible to be solved. I don't know what I'm going to do. You really can't solve it. No, I can't. Well, if you knew how to solve it, how would you do it? Oh, if I knew how to solve it? Oh, well, I do. And you can trick yourself into being honest. And I've found that trick to be very useful as well.
That's wonderful. And there's actually an NLP class at Osher at UNM.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, it's very handy. It's a form of self-hypnosis or a form of hypnotizing other people. You can get people to have major discoveries. And another example would be the two questions in terms of a person who's frustrated. Somebody's at work very, very upset. They didn't get promoted. All right. But I'll back it up. So why are you upset at work? Well, I didn't get promoted. All right. But that doesn't go deeply enough, because the next question gets to the root of things. So you want to get promoted? Yes. Well, what would that do for you? What would it do for me? Oh, well, then I'd know they respected me. Or then I'd get more money. So in this two-step, what's the problem? What do you want? What will it do for you? And if you structure those, you can learn a lot about yourself. And anyhow, I found it to be very helpful. And if you're a spy novelist, the CIA teaches NLP. So if you want to be a spy novelist, you really have to know how NLP works. It's used in interrogations. It's used with operatives learning how to blend with groups and how to instantly establish rapport with somebody. It's a very, very powerful technique.
Wow. Speaking, I guess, of spy novelists and knowing what they're doing when they're writing, you've talked a lot about the research you've had to do for your novels, or you've done for your novels. Maybe you didn't have to, but you've had some wonderful stories out of that research. Would you like to share some maybe with people?
Well, first of all, you hear this bromide that says, write what you know about. Well, I find that to be kind of a boring challenge. Instead, I recommend people to write what you'd like to learn about. So often in books, I choose a topic, photography, as I mentioned, with double image. And I said, I'm going to go out and learn as much as I can about photography. I won't necessarily be a great photographer, but I'll learn the history of photographs. I'll learn why one photograph is considered better than another, and about the drives that various photographers had that made them great. And it was just thrilling. When I start prepping for a book, I've got books. For a novel, I've got all these research books, and then I do the interviews, because each kind of topic has its own dialogue, has its own way of expressing. So I wouldn't dream of writing a book unless I started with the research first, knowing what the topic is, of course. In the process, the one people most find interesting is in West Texas, near a town called Marfa, which is also known because the film Giant with James Dean and Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor was filmed there. Wonderful film. But mysterious lights there appear just after dark on many nights. And these lights have been appearing since people first, at least Anglos, first moved through there in the 1880s. And I have seen the lights, and they are extraordinary. They're at a distance, they rise like this, they combine, they separate, they change colors. And speaking of hypnotism with NLP, they are hypnotic. In the Second World War, there was an air base near there, training flyers to go to the European or Pacific theater. And one of the things they did as an exercise was they chased the lights. And in trainers, where you could open the window, they flew over where they thought the lights originated and dropped paper sacks filled with flour, so they could come in the daytime and see where these, and what could they learn. The lights exist, but I think it's a version of ball lightning. And because of the altitude, 5,000 feet, the what's in the soil, which when heated gives off a stray electricity, that kind of thing. I don't think there's anything mysterious, but they are really something. Anyhow, I figured that if I was going to write about the lights, and if I was going to have scenes such as I described, well, I guess I'd better learn how to fly a plane. We've seen, the nonsense. I'm now a licensed pilot. I wasn't before I started the book. And, talk about learning something about yourself and adding to your skills because of a novel. But I am appalled and horrified when I see non-pilots writing aircraft scenes, and they clearly didn't bother to ask anybody. They don't know anything about the radio work. And there's a famous There's a film with Denzel Washington as a pilot where he's in a passenger jet, a big one, where he turns the plane upside down to fly. Well, aerodynamically, that sucker is going to crash. It never meant to be upside down. The lift isn't in the wings. And I mean, I know one novelist who had, there's a plane on autopilot. It's a Cessna. It's a single prop aircraft. And it's got a bomb on board. All right. So he's in another plane above it, and he's going to be lowered down on a cable. Mind you, this is at 130 miles an hour, or in aircraft speak, it's nautical miles an hour. So he's going to be sort of going like this, you know, because he's not as heavy as the aircraft beneath him, but he gets down somehow under, the door is underneath the wing. So somehow he gets underneath that wing at 130 nautical miles an hour and manages to open the door with all the force of that wind against it. But he saves the day. He gets in there. And I mean, I was sick. And, you know, and people were, you know, they bought this garbage. And any of you who are writing about firearms knows that if you don't get your firearms right, if you don't go, if you're going to write about a firearm, by God, you better have shot the thing, because somebody is going to send you the nastiest letters, emails, and these will multiply as word goes out that you don't know your shoe from a firearm. And they will threaten never again to read your books, and will, you know, whatever it is they threaten, you know, usually it's proctological threats. So, I mean, there's just, if you're like, people write books about courtrooms without having been in courtrooms. And they see it on TV, and they think attorneys actually go up to the witness stand and lean over the witness stand and virtually shake the witness in order to get the truth out of them. They'd be in jail. The judge would put them away for intimidation, at least. The attorneys have to stand a respectful distance away in front of a podium. And similarly, people go into emergency wards in their fiction, which is so unlike the way it is in real life, but that resembles the nuttiness that you see in movies and TV. So, I mean, it just makes sense to do the research.
I appreciate that. Having read a book about Louisiana where you could see the mountains from the window.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Now,
Or
getting a
movies
pilot,
that do it too.
getting a pilot's license is pretty drastic, but you even talked about doing a wilderness program at one point.
Yes, I did. I have a novel called Testament, in which a man and his family are pursued and are forced to go into the mountains of Wyoming, where in effect they relive the Old West. And so I got to thinking about it, and I went to the library. This is before the internet. And I went to the library, and it all sounded so phony. It was like they were all reading each other, but none of them have ever been in the woods. So there's a place in Wyoming called the National Outdoor Leadership School. NOLS is the acronym. And it's based there, but they have schools, all branch campuses everywhere, in Mexico and Alaska, and all over the place. But back then, they had a wilderness guide course. And I lived in the Wind River Mountains with 20 other people for 30 days, based upon what we could carry in and what we could get for fishing and scavenging. And I like to think, my memory says 30 pounds, and I think maybe I'm exaggerating. For sure, I lost 20 pounds. But boy, did I learn a lot. And, you know, the graduation exercise was with a map and a canteen and a compass, that was it, to travel for 3 days to a spot marked on the map, which was over the Continental Divide, to a pickup spot where a truck would be waiting for me. And I mean, oh my heavens, what an adventure. So I wrote about that experience in Testament. I realized that I'd never read what felt like an authentic car fight in a novel. You see them in the movies, most of them are fakey. The only, there's the bullet chase, there's the French Connection chase, and there's the chase in Ronin, which to me are the three big ones. So I called a friend of mine who was with diplomatic security and asked where they learned to handle cars in emergencies. And I was sent to the Bill Scott Raceway in West Virginia, where I spent a week learning how to car fight at 50 miles an hour, running barricades and blockades and doing all the spinning and all that stuff. I don't know, it was extremely, it made me a better driver. But also it was just extremely informative and, very helpful in various scenes that I might want to put in a novel.
One of the things I find fascinating in your book, you're talking about, we're working in the writer's world. We understand that, and we've got our own language and our own way of doing things, and people are learning to understand that world. But to step from the writer's world into the movie world sounds like it was an interesting experience when you were working with the Rambo film.
I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America, the Western division. There's an Eastern one as well. And I've been a member since 1979. Over the years, I've been asked either to write scripts based upon my novels or other novels or originals, none of which have been produced. I'm vested in the Writers Guild. I have years and years and years of experience and income that I earned, get a pension from the Writers Guild, but the way the business works is that what tends to be the first person, I'll give you an example on Brotherhood of the Rose, which was an NBC miniseries of my novel, Brotherhood of the Rose. I love to be able to cite that one because it's the only miniseries ever to air after a Super Bowl. And the only one, I just love to be able to say that. So I wrote 4 drafts of that 4-hour miniseries. They then hired my mentor friend, who was also the executive producer, Sterling Silliphant, an Oscar winner for In the Heat of the Night. He's one of the reasons I became a writer. They then hired him to do a draft. And then they decided to hire a man named Guy Waldron, whom I do not know. I'm not knocking his work. I'm just saying that he then became the 3rd writer. And Sterling phoned me one day and he said, David, I've decided that they have no choice. They must make the miniseries. And I said, why is that? And he said, because they paid you. They paid me, they paid Guy, they've had other expenses. They're in this so deep that unless they make it, they're going to lose their jobs. And sure enough, a month later, they greenlit it with Guy's script as the template. And then the writer's strike hit, which meant that they couldn't have writers doing rewrites. And as Sterling told me, after a while, they were using my novel for the dialogue for the scenes that they were using. So it's a bizarre, otherworldly thing in which you have to get used to except for some circumstances, such as my friendship with Sterling, that in many cases you're dealing with people who are so narcissistic that they are determined to look out for themselves at any cost and will sell you out as quickly as they could if it was in their best interest. So the rule number 1 when working with the movies, unless you have reason to say otherwise, is don't trust anybody. And if you're on that basis, here's the story that's in The Successful Novelist. I was in a producer's office at Warner Brothers. And I was talking to him. We were in his office, and then next to him there was a little office in which he had his secretary. So the phone rang. The secretary answered it and said, "Yes, well, he's not available now. Okay, thank you. He'll get back to you. Thank you. Goodbye." And then he yelled to her, "Who is that?" And she yelled a name. And he said, I wonder what he wants. Phone Bob over at someplace else. And so she phoned Bob to find out what Joe was calling my friend about. And then they did this whole round robin. And I don't think the first caller and the producer I was sitting with ever, in fact, ever talked. And that's the movie business.
That's really different. I hope that's different than what we're living in the
No.
writer's world.
No, it will never change.
So were you surprised when they did a series of First Blood, when they used the First Blood Rambo character for a series?
Well, yes and no. First of all, you know, let us allow, and I look at this as a disinterest, as a separate party. To me, this is just amazing. All right. And the fact that I wrote a novel, First Blood, in which a character named Rambo became a character in a movie, became a character in another movie, another movie, another movie, and another movie, and became internationally recognized. This happens almost never to an author. In the 20th century, from novels to movies, there was Sherlock Holmes, there was Tarzan, there was James Bond, there was Rambo, and there was Harry Potter. Characters in novels to movies. I mean, you know, other characters such as Indiana Jones were original to a series. Happens seldom. And I, you know, I look at this as like I'm a professor at heart. So I look at this as some kind of weird social phenomenon, and it's really interesting to me. You know, I'm like a professor analyzing what happened. And the movie went through 26 scripts and 4 studios from 1972 when I sold the rights to 82 when it was filmed. So the odds, I mean, how did this happen? And the original version of the film had Rambo die as he does in my novel. But they tested it and an audience said, this is crazy. We cheered for him. Why is he dead? So they reshot the ending so that he lived. The producers had no intention of doing this, but they were forced to. And then the movie was such a hit that they said, oh my God, we can make sequels, which had not occurred to them starting out. So the whole thing has a kind of a wonderful science fiction aspect to it that I find very enjoyable. And you know, it's cool to be able to say that I created one of the major characters of the 20th century. How weird, you know, how fun.
It's wonderful. And the fact that it has never gone out of print, First Blood, I mean, do you think, we actually had a question from one of our members asking if you thought that said something about the state of society when you have these different factions like the Vietnam vets and the Korean vets dealing with issues that are different war-shaped generations, if that says something about us that it's still around so well thought of.
Until recently, I would have thought that the summer of 1968, when there were several hundred riots across the United States, and as well 2 terrible assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, First Blood was written in response to that tearing apart of America, in which I was writing an allegory in which Rambo represented a disaffected war veteran. I mean, somebody who hated the war, who hated what had happened to him, but had all the skills that he didn't want to have. And a veteran from Korea, the Korean War, which was a traditional war. So in my mind, it was the Korean War traditional meets the Vietnam War guerrilla style. It was an Eisenhower Republican meets, because Cecil was old enough to be Rambo's father in the movie, they're brothers, as it were. And Rambo, as it were, a radicalized Vietnam veteran. And there were many other, parts of the allegory with which Colonel Troutman representing the system, who finally destroys Rambo, because that's what happens. So here we have one kind of novel with a theme that then in the second one, in the film adaptation, made Rambo a victim, not a furious veteran. And I understand why that is the case, and I don't knock the movie. I like the movie. I recorded a a movie-length audio commentary that's on Blu-rays about the novel and about the movie and all the background, and I really like the movie. And I like the second one as a cartoon, sort of. The third one has some structural problems. The fourth one is closest to the tone of my novel, and the fifth one really isn't a Rambo film. So we just exclude that. It's wild the way they evolved, so that the Rambo in my novel is not quite the Rambo in the first film. He's definitely not the Rambo in the second and third film. In the fourth, he's the Rambo of my novel, and in the fifth one, God knows what he is. It's again, the professor in me finds this fascinating, that the character evolved as society evolved.
I actually had a question while you were talking about that. Somebody wanted to know how you found the writing, how you were able to write the fighting scenes so well with that one. Did you have to research that too?
In First Blood, I took weapons classes from the NRA when the NRA was not a political organization, when it was mostly devoted to teaching people about firearms. So I learned quite a lot there. I spoke. The best experience I had, again, remember, I do interviews. I try to get a three-dimensional perspective. And I was at Penn State as a grad student, and Penn State was generous enough to allow me to teach writing to freshman students in exchange for my tuition. So I was, at the time, 23, 24. And I wound up with a class of freshmen who were returned Vietnam veterans, who were my age, and who didn't understand what I was up in front of them teaching when I should have been in the war. Well, I was born in Canada. I was then a Canadian citizen. I'm now an American citizen. I was married. I had a child in 1967, 68. There was no way I was going to be in that war. So when I explained to them the background, they got it, and they began telling me about what it was like to come home. So it was largely through the interviews I conducted after class with those students that gave me the perspective on what to do in the novel. And as for the action scenes, the Pentagon wrote to me at the time. I'm not remembering this exactly, but it was something along the Pentagon's Department of Brain Research. This isn't like, there's no such thing, but it was along those lines. And some medical doctor, psychologist, in a letter, this is way in the olden days, when we chiseled messages on rocks, he asked if I'd never been in combat, how is it that by common consent of people who had been in combat, that I had it right? And I had no explanation except that I had an imagination. And what he told me, I don't know if it's a compliment, he told me that I had an overdeveloped limbic brain. We have three parts to our brain. The first is the limbic, or so-called reptilian brain. And then there's a larger brain which handles the limbic brain is the fight or flight brain, the adrenaline brain. And then they're larger, it's like the cortexes, or I don't know anything about the brain. But apparently I have an overdeveloped reptilian brain that allows me to imagine intense situations in which I am able to describe the right kinds of physiological, psychological responses. I don't know. I'm a very conscious writer, but this part's all a mystery to me.
Thank you. I have another question, sort of switching gears a little bit. One of your more recent series was the Thomas de Quincy series, which was just fascinating. I love that. A little bit of horror mixed in with the mystery, and and everything. Could you just sort of give maybe the audience who have not read it yet a brief description of what that time period was about and what the series is about, so I can ask you
Sure.
questions?
And you know, a kind of self-discovery for me. I've been doing this a long time. I'm ending my 4th decade. I don't look ancient, but I've been around. And what I've realized is that my career is defined by exploring genres. That I started with outdoor action with Rambo, First Blood. In the 80s, I moved into espionage with the Brotherhood of the Rose, the Fraternity of the Stone, and the League of Night and Fog. I segued into other genres. I wrote a techno thriller for fun, the one about the lights in West Texas, the Shimmer it's called. I wrote non-supernatural horror, Creepers, which received one of my Stoker Awards. And I thought, well, let's write a Victorian novel. You know, why not? And of course, you know, anybody who knew me, and even those who advised me, said, are you really sure that the creator of Rambo wants to write a Victorian novel? Well, my whole career has been devoted to writing what I'm passionate for. So I had learned about a man named Thomas de Quincy, who was famous in the 1800s for having been the first person in English to write about opium addiction. Now, at the time, there was no concept of addiction. They called it a habit, which could easily, with character, be defeated. Much later, we understand how complicated this is. And he had written a book called Confessions of an English Opium Beater, which was like an expose. And everybody had opium in their house. It was a laudanum, which is a combination of opium and alcohol, was the only effective pain reliever. They had it at home the way we have aspirin. Everybody took laudanum, which again is opium mixed with alcohol. So not only do you get to be a drug addict, you get to be an alcoholic. And so De Quincy talked about what it had done to him. And oh my God, but it made him famous. And thereafter, for the rest of his life, he was known as the opium eater. And when he went into a restaurant, there's the opium eater. Well, hey, it's a brand, right? It's getting to be known. And because of his drug addiction, looking into his mind, he invented the word subconscious a half century before Freud, and invented basically the psychoanalysis that you and I spoke about earlier. And I thought this would be really cool to have Thomas de Quincy mixed up with newly created Scotland Yard. And the book takes place in 1854. Scotland Yard was created in 1842 in response to attempts to assassinate Queen Victoria. And so they were happy to make plaster casts of footprints. This is really cool. Look what expert crime scene people we are. And in comes De Quincy saying, the mind is composed of sunless abysses in which there are secret chambers where alien natures hide undetected. Oh my God, what a concept. So I just jumped on this as a way of exploring this wonderful character and introducing the concept of psychoanalysis way before Freud, who seems to have lifted from De Quincy. And then there's the other element. In 2009, when I decided to write the first book, which was called Murder is a Fine Art, my granddaughter died. She was 14, her name was Natalie, and she died after a long, harrowing, terrible illness, a rare cancer called Ewing's sarcoma, bone cancer. And only 200 people get the disease each year in the United States. That's how rare it is. And Natalie had it on her left pelvic bone. So they had to remove her left pelvis. But that wasn't good enough. They still didn't get the disease. She went through chemotherapy and she died. Now, my son, Matthew, age 15 in 1987, died from the same disease. So only 200 people get it each year in the United States. What are the odds of two people in the same family getting it when all the research says it is not inherited? So I was stunned. I was, as was my wife, as was our daughter, whose daughter had died. And I decided that I was going to retreat from the world and go to 1854 London, a little bit like the way Jack Finney does in Time and Again, when his character goes to turn of the century New York City. And for several years in 3 books, I lived in 1854, 1855 London. I was able to do so successfully that when my wife and I went to London on a research trip, I was able, with my knowledge of 1854 streets, to make my way on foot around London, and to the astonishment of my wife. There again, we have an example of a book which I could not have written. It was so personal to me. And as someone said, here's the kicker. Thomas de Quincy had a daughter named Emily. She was 21 when he was 69 when the series begins. And these are all real things. Everything about these characters is true in the novel. And I was at a book event at Poison Pen in Scottsdale with Barbara Peters, who owns the bookstore and also co-owns Poison Pen Press, or co-runs it. They've now sold it to Source Books. And on stage, all right, because Barbara's very smart, and so she, okay, you want to play self-psychoanalysis? She said, how old were you when you started the books? And I said, I was 69. And she says, yeah, when De Quincy, how old was he, right? So she said, because Emily is the cement in this book. It's the glue. She's the propulsion. My metaphors are all screwed up here, but you get the idea. She is the dominant force in the novel. And Barbara said to me, so maybe Emily is your version of Natalie, your version of your granddaughter. So now I'm on stage, but I am fearless about revealing things about myself. And I immediately understood the truth. And that was why I'd written the series. I was making Natalie alive again in Emily. So that's why I did those books. And the goal was to write a novel that could have been presented, 3 of them, that could have been published in 1854. That they would have no modern techniques. They would have only the techniques available then, with the exception that a psychoanalysis is used, because it's true to De Quincy. But because these books were written now, not in 1854, we see them from a modern perspective to 1854. It's very fancy. It's a technique known as meta. And I just love to do this stuff.
I take it that then the series is done. You're not going to be writing anymore the time period, or?
I did. The intent was to do 3 because De Quincy was an addict. And it was killing him, although he lived to be 74 and he was drinking a pint of this stuff a day. So, a tablespoon would kill you and he was drinking a pint of it. It's fascinating that he lived that long. Ask your question again. I got so interested in his age.
I was just wondering if you had plans for any more in the series or the time period.
I knew I was going to do 3 in which his addiction and the cost of it proceeds. So at the end, we see the cost. And throughout, the 2 Scotland Yard detectives, and one's a younger man, and he keeps coming up to Emily and sort of, hinting, because, they were very, very conventional. You cloaked your words. And he says, you ever think about getting married? But he's very subtle about it. And she looks at him and basically says, I'm jazzing this up. He says, are you kidding me? Have you seen my father? Have you seen what I have to do to take care of him? Do you think I want another man to take care of? And in life, Emily never married. And she lived, this is amazing, she lived until 1916. She lived into the middle of the First World War from 1854 when she was 21. Isn't that cool?
That's cool.
Anyway, I proposed a fourth one, and the publishing world changed in 2013 with streaming. And the publishing world changed again in the last 4 years with publishers, not because of all the turmoil. I think no matter Republican or Democrat, you have to agree it's been crazy. And publishers don't know what to do. They are either pushing brand names or they're pushing social novels to try to get the niche of, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, you'll see one of the best-selling novels has been about a Mexican immigrant who tries to get across the border into the United States with her family. Very timely idea. And that's been on the list forever, because I guess no matter what view you have about the border, that's something that might interest you. So basically, I was told that there was no interest in a fourth novel. I was willing to do a fourth one. And I had the plot, I had the title, and I was really excited. But publishing is a ever-moving industry. And of course, now we have one major publisher who was purchased by another major publisher. So where we used to have 5 big 5, now we have 4. And the whole thing is contracting. And so I get it. So perversely, I said, all right, I'm going to write a Western. So for 2 years, I've been working on a Western, a novel of the American West, a Western about Westerns, which incorporates the history of the genre and the history of the American West after the Civil War. How's that? So, and whether it'll ever be published, I have no idea, and truly don't care. I'm just so hooked on this and determined to write it. And but I never had more fun if, given all the pain, the emotion, I never had greater satisfaction than writing the 3 Thomas de Quincy, Emily Victorian novels. I mean, I'm choking up in a way here. I just loved those characters so much.
I certainly do see a lot of streaming Netflix specials about that time period. So it surprises me that the publishers aren't jumping on that.
Well, it became glutted on TVs. There were so many. There's Ripper Street, and I mean, we could go, through the list. There were like a half a dozen. And when we pitched them for movies, the producers on the West Coast said, "But it's glutted. The market is glutted," and so everything has its time. And if you write a book to try, and we get very practical here for people listening, the 2 mottos I have is be a first-rate version of yourself and not a second-rate version of another author. And 2, do not chase the market because it moves fast. And yes, you can still write a domestic suspense noir movie about unreliable narrators, but by God, it better be good because the publishers are sick of them unless they see one they think has a new edge. So I never did chase the market. And, a lot of people said, don't Victorian. My best reviews and a lot of awards. And it sold very well. They sold very well. But, as I said, times change. And so you have to say, why are you doing this? Are you doing it because you want to be famous? This is crazy. Are you doing it because you want to be rich? It would be nice to earn a lot of money, but most times people interpret that to mean to chase the market and, get on the coattails of somebody else. And chances are that's not going to work. Most of the people that make the big money are originals. So that's a digression, but that more than anything might be helpful to people.
You mentioned the market. Do you have any other insights into the publishing world and what's going on with all the craziness right now?
Well, yeah, it's amazing how swiftly things change. I mean, it seems like the olden days when ebooks broke through in 2009. That's 11 years ago. It feels like an eternity. And oh my God, it's the future. We're going to do all that. And then in 2013, Netflix released House of Cards. And they did two things that everybody said was so crazy. How insane. Why would you do this? How stupid. They were going to pay movie star salaries to somebody in a TV series. In that case, it was specifically, oh, come on, help me here.
Kevin Spacey.
Kevin Spacey, thank you. And Kevin, of course, had a fall from grace after that. But at the time, multiple Oscar winner, a director of the Old Vic in London, I mean, this was gold plated. And he got a Robin Wright, who was also a movie star, but not Kevin Spacey movie star. And Robin had been in very prestigious things, but this isn't a generic, a gender thing. It was, how people perceived who was most bankable, and Kevin was bankable. So they paid him a fortune. How stupid. And then they said, even more stupidly, how stupid, we're going to show all of the first season the first day. No. What you do is you have this one, and then next week you show episode 2, and next week after that, episode 3. And if you got 12 episodes or 10, if it's 10 weeks. What's the matter with you? You're going to glut the market. Well, bang, history changed. And now the whole thing is streaming. And with COVID, it's even more streaming. I mean, wonderful movies like News of the World, great Western. Oh my heavens, do I like that movie? Which was in theaters, for the 2 people brave enough to go, and is now streaming. Well, actually, it's video on demand. You got to pay $20 to see it, and it'll eventually stream. So basically, even feature films are now being moved over to streaming. So before the unpleasantness, when I was, going around in public, talking about books, I always start a conversation by saying, what are you reading? And the answer I would get invariably was, I'm too busy to read. And then, of course, in my NLP way, I would say, why are you too busy to read? I'm watching television. All right. So, I mean, look at the millions of people per day that are watching streamed entertainment. Well, they're not reading. So publishers then realized that that was their competition. So what are we going to do? So interestingly, streaming is about niche. Streaming is about, if you want a deaf detective in Australia who owns a kangaroo, you can have that series. It hasn't been made yet, but I'm confident soon it will be. Pick your, and better yet, we'll make the detective have an Aboriginal background. Let's put in, so it's niche. And I'm not trying to be, I assume in today's world, somebody will say, because I mentioned somebody being deaf, they'll say I'm being disrespectful. Not at all. I'm simply talking about different ways that characteristics can be combined. You can go, you go on Netflix or Amazon and they'll give you the niches. You know, you can go to Acorn and you can go to the Cozies and you can go, it's just, and my wife likes the travelogue mysteries. They're all the same, but one's set in Wales and one's set in New Zealand and one's set in the Arctic, and they're all the same plot, but we get to see, it's like we can't travel. So, hey, it's cool, we get the scenery. So interesting, while streaming is a niche market, publishers went for the common denominator. They went for the big hit that would bring in everyone. So if you look at the New York Times list as an example, you'll see brand name authors heavily promoted. You'll see social topics books, and you'll see science fiction sometimes, but the general attempt is to find that one book which will be so overwhelmingly popular that it'll bring in sales for everybody else. Well, that's not going to happen. In today's world, I mean, look at where we are. I mean, you know, you can't have a civil discourse on Facebook. I've had to ban people on Facebook for saying the darndest things, the most vulgar things. And I just remind them I'm keeping a list now. For 10 years, I had to ban only 3 people for foul language. Now I'm having to do it every day. I mean, the people are at each other's throats. Well, how are you going to get a common denominator out of that? You can't. I'm seeing a contraction. Now, this is my view. You know, if you go to talk to somebody else, they say, oh, he's nuts. And that's fine. Maybe I am. But my view is that in response to streaming and the overwhelming amount that's available, publishing contracted and shows fewer authors and fewer topics that they thought would be the sorts of things they want to go for, which then takes us back to the beauty of self-publishing. Because in a world where it's tough to get an original vision recognized by traditional publishers who claim that's what they're looking for, but I'm not seeing any sign of it, who claim that's what they're doing. And what you have is, for ebooks, you have that opportunity. And as I'm also a member of Western Writers of America, and one of my friend authors there said, you know, I could have had a contract for a book, and they said, well, they might release it 2 years from now, or I could take the book and self-publish it and it'd be out next month. What am I going to do? And he went for the self-publishing. Now, unfortunately, everybody else has thought this way, so that there are no firm records about this, but estimates that I respect suggest that in 2019, there were as many as 800,000 self-published books. So how are you going to shout louder than anybody else? This is, you know, the turmoil in publishing is in a way, except it's not like foul the way the tone of the various groups. The turmoil in publishing sort of is a parallel to, you know, what's going on. And I don't know what's going to happen. In 1968, I tell you, I thought the Republic was finished. And somehow, I guess people got tired. I don't know.
So it sounds like you don't have the magic bullet for us.
I have no magic bullet, except be the first-rate version of yourself and don't chase the market. And if you write for money or you write for fame, you're automatically done for. Except in a rare, I only know one author who was able, Message in a Bottle, who wrote that? And somebody help me. Well,
somebody will put it in the chat.
It's not hard to look up. He told me, I was at a writer's event, he took me aside, and he said he figured it out. There were, in each category, there were 3 authors who dominated. And so he looked for a category that didn't have 3 authors. And he found it in the male romance, where there were only 2 at the time. And one of them passed on or quit or what have you. And so he was going to be the second one. And he was.
Nicholas Sparks.
Nicholas Sparks. His manipulation of the market was astonishingly brilliant. His books are all the same. Congratulations to him. But if anybody out there thinks they can become the next Nicholas Sparks, you're chasing a dragon's tail. That was a fluke. Talk about a fluke is a whale where the whale spout is. So now, if I talk long enough, I'll descend into so many mixed metaphors that no one will understand me. But write the book you're meant to write. If no one wants it in the traditional publishing, self-publish it. Have the conviction to follow through. But it may or may not work for you. The odds are, to be a success in publishing, the odds are not good. But the self-satisfaction is another matter. I'm writing my Western for myself. There's no market for a Western. But I am in that world. It is for me satisfying. What I advocate is, if you write a book you don't like because you think it's going to sell and make money and it doesn't, and you spend a year on the thing and it doesn't sell, more fool you. But if you write the book you wanted to write and it doesn't sell, well, I use the example of Steve Berry. In the 90s, and I'm flattered because Steve told me that he became a writer because of the Brotherhood of the Rose, and that he wanted to write thrillers because of that. And in the 90s, I think he wrote 8 novels, and he wrote, I forget how many rejections, over 100. And I don't know how many agents he went through. Maybe it was just the one who stayed with him. And in one of those crazy moments, Dan Brown, who had written a couple of books that did okay, not great, but okay, which is what most books do. But the Da Vinci Code, they thought maybe was going to be something else. And before he was Dan Brown, when he was the writer of those other books, he agreed to blurb Steve Berry's debut novel. Now, you can't replicate that, right? And then the Da Vinci Code hit, and then Steve Berry's book came out, and people came in and said, what have you got like the Da Vinci Code? And they say, we don't know, but here's a book that Dan Brown blurbed. Give it to me. So his first novel was a New York Times bestseller because of a blurb from Dan Brown. You can't make that happen. But that's an example of Steve writing what he wanted to. In his case, he loved to travel. So he was writing, he'd go places and then imagine stories set in the places, international places he visited, so they were kind of travelogues. And also he loved history, so he was sort of doing a Dan Brown, but in a slightly different way. But he knew what he was doing, what he wanted to do, and he did it and did it and did it and did it and did it 8 times until bing, that was the moment. So what are our choices here? We need to understand at our core who we are and what we want and what it is we're trying to do. This is not easy.
No, it's not, is it? I actually only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask some questions from
my
people
heavens,
who.
look at that.
I know, it's just so much fun. Can we do this for another hour? Is that okay?
I talk too much, but
No,
anyway.
no, never. I have one question that was submitted earlier from a member asking if you've ever dealt with professional jealousy in this world, in the writing world, and if so, what advice you have for up and coming writers.
When I was in a writer's group once. It was not successful because I wanted to write thrillers, thrillers in the form of horror and spy and westerns and all that. But that's what I wanted to do, and the folks in that group were all determined to write like they were writing for the New Yorker. What I had was a lot of contempt directed toward me. I had a lot of, in a way, jealousy, because like it or not, I wrote better than they did. I didn't have cliches, for example. And I remember when First Blood came out, and I showed it to friends, lifelong friends, whom I'd known for years, and then through college, and they tore pages out of the book. They wrote obscene comments in the book. They drove over the book with automobiles and then mailed it to me. In popular fiction, it is not, and there's this popular fiction is as serious as any other fiction, but it just happens to be read by more people. In popular fiction, I have seen very little jealousy among authors, but I was at the University of Iowa. I was in the English department, but I saw the writer's workshop, and I saw the infighting among the students. And I saw the infighting among visiting authors, reputable authors, you know, hugely prize-winning authors who would come in, who were always trying to game against other people. And I remember one I won't mention his name, you know, who came in and sidled me, you know, and said, "Come on over here," and said, "How much money do you earn?" And I thought, all right, I get this. So anyway, in my world, there's very little jealousy, but in other aspects of writing, there's a lot of it.
I appreciate that. We have a couple of questions, I believe, from the audience, and Lainey was going to tell us what they were. And I don't know if we've covered them all or not yet. Lainey?
We can hang around a little longer if you need to.
Oh, you're so kind.
And I think you were talking earlier, David, were you talking about interviews? Because this question is, do people you interview expect to be paid for their time and advice? And I can't remember what preceded that.
We never covered that, but I've never been interviewed where I paid anybody. That nobody, if anybody's asking to be paid for an interview, that this is wrong. This is you know, it's like a editor or an agent who wants money in order to read a manuscript. This is a hoax. I mean, you know, run away from that.
And the next question is, can you ask David the status of his meta Western? You might have covered that. He is currently writing it. You did talk about that.
Well, I'll go on. I'm in my eighth draft. Normally it's 3 drafts. All right. I mean, you know, maybe this is an example. You know, sometimes I wonder. Okay, sometimes this is unusual. It took me 3 years to write First Blood. I never spent that long on a novel again until now. I'm into my 3rd year now. But it keeps changing. The problem with a Western is it has so many cliches, so many familiar elements. And so what I'm trying to do is write a Western where everybody recognizes it's a Western, but doesn't catch me in any of the cliches. So I'm having to reinvent all of the things that we take for granted in a Western and try to make them as satisfying as the things that we're familiar with. And for fun, just because I'm that way, almost all the characters have last names that are associated with great Westerns. So that there's a town council in which all the last names are great directors. And I have a newspaper reporter named, God, I can't even think of his name now. I won't even go into that. I'm using the name of Edmund O'Brien, who plays the newspaper editor in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and the editor, newspaper owner, is a man named Peabody in that. So I'm putting together those 2 names, and so underneath all of this, subliminally, I'm hoping that these names, without being identified, and if I didn't say what I'd done, nobody will know it. But that this will, you know, rise, that there'll be something, as it were, churning under the surface that suggests all the classic Westerns that I'm trying to reinvent. That's pretty meta.
Okay.
That's very meta.
Question. You were a writer on Wolverine, Spider-Man, and Captain America comic books. Which one was the most fun to write? Have you got a favorite hero, a superhero character?
Probably it would be Batman, but Batman is in the DC universe. So Batman's nice and dark. He's really, really twisted. I was invited, breaking into the comic book market is impossible. But I was invited by Marvel to write for them. But then I had to teach myself there is no book about how to write comic books. So I had to teach myself how to do that. It was really rewarding, and each of them is very different. And in each of them, my first principle is, what's the core of the story I'm trying to tell? So in each case, what is the core of Captain America? Okay, he's a superhero since shortly after Pearl Harbor in the early 1940s. And he's been a superhero named after the United States all these years. What's that feel like? Is he getting tired? So it was about the burden about being a superhero named after the United States. And I did the same thing with Spider-Man, and Spider-Man is the key is with great power comes great responsibility. What does that mean? So I wrote a two-part in which he has a choice between saving his aunt or saving other people. So which is he going to choose? And what would be the emotional cost if he chose one over the other? I had a lot of fun doing those. And it's not everybody gets to do, the trifecta of characters like that.
This has just been fantastic, David. I really, really appreciate you being here with us. I don't want to keep you all afternoon, which I would do, but I guess people would probably leave.
If there's still a few more we can do it, I don't want
to,
to,
sitting here alone.
Well, there you go. Are people leaving us? Well, that's right.
Well, we've got a workshop that starts at 12:30.
Okay,
so
yes,
I think people are running out.
But I know some of my comments might have been sobering, but you have to know why you're doing something, and to address that. And in my experience, when I spoke to Southwest writers a year ago, and it was recorded, that it's available on your website, the video recording. And what I said was that over the years, I've talked to writers, and it seems to me the problem they have when they're writing a book is they don't know what they want to accomplish. Maybe they want to be rich, maybe they want to be famous, or maybe they just want to finish a book, but they don't know the specific goal of the project. What is, when Alan J. Lerner wrote Camelot, above his typewriter, he had Camelot, how our dreams exceed our abilities. And that was his goal, to express that in the text. And so I do that for myself, and then I know what I'm trying to accomplish. And the question is, do I have the drive to do it? Is it that important to me? I think in some ways, this is simpler than people make it. If you know what you want to accomplish, it should not be difficult to make the choices of opening scene, next scene, next scene, next scene, in order to accomplish that goal. But of course, other things get in the way, and often we don't know what we want to accomplish until maybe we're well into the project, which is what happened with me with the Western, which is why I'm writing 8 drafts of the darn thing.
That's wonderful.
My own wagon train.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for giving us your time and your advice and answers. And you're getting all kinds of comments over here in the chat thanking you for being here.
Oh, well, thank you.
We really appreciate it.
I hope I'm useful, as opposed to just, talking about my experiences.
Always, always. Thank you, thank you, thank you.